The Jacob Wetterling case, 27 years of silence. The recording crackles with static, but the young voice cuts through clearly, trembling with fear that still echoes decades later. He was like a man, little bit. He had like nylon thing or the mask. The investigator presses gently. You know what color it was? And then comes the sentence that would haunt an entire nation. He grabbed Jacob and then he told me to run as fast as I could into the woods or else he'd shoot. 3 boys rode their bikes to a convenience store on what should have been an ordinary autumn evening in rural Minnesota. Only 2 of them came home. This is the story of the abduction that changed America forever. Before we dive deep into one of the most haunting mysteries that gripped this nation for nearly 3 decades, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on your notifications because this case is unlike anything you've heard before. This story changed everything about how we protect our children in this country. Drop a comment below telling me if you remember where you were when you first heard about Jacob Wetterling. Now, let's get into this incredibly complex and heartbreaking case that would consume investigators, volunteers, and an entire community for 27 long years. The evening of October 22, 1989 started like countless others in the small town of St. Joseph, Minnesota. This was a community where people still left their doors unlocked, where children rode their bikes freely through neighborhoods as streetlights began to flicker on, signaling the approaching dinner hour. It was a place where the worst thing that usually happened was a stolen bicycle or teenagers causing minor mischief on weekend nights. Nobody in St. Joseph could have imagined that this particular Sunday evening would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would span nearly 3 decades and fundamentally alter the American landscape of child safety laws. Jacob Wetterling was 11 years old, a bright, energetic boy with his whole life ahead of him. He lived with his parents, Jerry and Patty Wetterling, and his siblings in a comfortable home in this quiet Minnesota town. Jacob was the kind of kid that neighbors remembered fondly, always polite, always smiling, the type of child who seemed to embody everything good about growing up in small-town America. On that October evening, Jacob wanted to do something completely normal, completely innocent. He and his younger brother Trevor, who was 10 years old, along with their friend Aaron Larson, also 11, decided to ride their bikes to the Tom Thumb convenience store about a half-mile from the Wetterling home to rent a video. The sun had already set by the time the 3 boys pedaled away from the Wetterling residence around 9 o'clock in the evening. They were excited about their small adventure, the kind of trip they had made numerous times before without incident. The route was familiar, the distance short, and in their minds and in the minds of their parents, there was no reason to worry. This was St. Joseph, Minnesota, after all. This was home. This was safe. Or so everyone believed. The boys successfully made it to Tom Thumb, rented their video, and began the return journey home. They were riding along a rural road, their bike lights cutting through the darkness, probably talking and laughing about the movie they were about to watch. The night was cool but not uncomfortably so, typical for Minnesota in late October. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. They were less than a half-mile from home. Safety was within reach. And then, in an instant, everything changed forever. A masked figure emerged from the darkness along the rural stretch of road. The boys later described him as appearing suddenly, as if materialized from the shadows themselves. He wore a dark mask that concealed his features, and he carried a gun. The terror of that moment is almost impossible to fully comprehend unless you've experienced something similar. These were young boys, children really, suddenly confronted with their worst nightmare made real. The masked man ordered all 3 boys off their bicycles. His voice was commanding, authoritative, terrifying. He made them lie face down on the ground in the ditch alongside the road. What happened next would be seared into the memories of the 2 boys who survived that night for the rest of their lives. The man asked each boy his age. When Jacob answered that he was 11, the man made a decision that would launch one of the largest criminal investigations in Minnesota history. He grabbed Jacob. He told Trevor and Aaron to run into the woods as fast as they could and not look back, threatening that if they did, he would shoot them. The two terrified boys did exactly as they were told, running blindly into the dark forest, their hearts pounding, their minds unable to process what was happening. When they finally stopped running and looked back toward the road, Jacob and the masked man were gone. Trevor and Aaron ran the rest of the way to the Wetterling home, bursting through the door with a story so horrifying that it seemed impossible, seemed like it couldn't be real. But it was real. Jacob was gone. Taken by a masked stranger on a quiet road in St. Joseph, Minnesota. The call to law enforcement came in at approximately 9:15 in the evening on October 22, 1989. Within minutes, police officers from multiple agencies began converging on the scene. What they found was chilling in its simplicity: 3 abandoned bicycles lying in the ditch along a rural road, and absolutely no sign of 11-year-old Jacob Wetterling. The initial response was immediate and massive. Local law enforcement quickly realized they were dealing with a potential child abduction, one of the most serious crimes imaginable. Within hours, the area was flooded with police officers, sheriff's deputies, and investigators from various agencies. Helicopters equipped with searchlights swept over the surrounding woods and fields. K-9 units were brought in to track any scent they could find. Roadblocks were established on every route leading out of the area. The hope in those early hours was that Jacob might still be nearby, that he might be found quickly, that this nightmare would end with a frightened but unharmed boy being reunited with his family. But as the hours stretched into days, that hope began to dim. The search expanded exponentially. Volunteers began arriving from all over the region, ultimately growing to more than 1,000 people dedicated to finding Jacob. They walked through fields, forests, and wetlands. They checked abandoned buildings, searched through culverts and drainage ditches, knocked on doors throughout the county. Every possible location where a child might be hidden or where evidence might be found was systematically investigated. The community of St. Joseph and the surrounding area came together in a way that demonstrated the very best of human nature in response to the very worst of human actions. Jerry and Patty Wetterling, Jacob's parents, became the public face of the search almost immediately. Their grief was raw and visible, but so was their determination. They appeared on local news broadcasts pleading for their son's safe return, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Patty, in particular, would become a tireless advocate not just for finding Jacob but for all missing children. Her strength in the face of unimaginable horror was remarkable. She refused to give up, refused to stop searching, refused to let Jacob be forgotten. The FBI joined the investigation within the first 24 hours, bringing federal resources to bear on the case. Special agents began conducting interviews, analyzing evidence, and developing profiles of potential suspects. The Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, Minnesota's state investigative agency, also committed significant resources to the case. This was now being treated as one of the highest priority investigations in the state's history. Every available tool, every investigative technique, every resource that could possibly help was being utilized. In those early days and weeks, investigators conducted hundreds of interviews. Trevor and Aaron, the 2 boys who had been with Jacob that night, were interviewed multiple times. The investigators needed every detail the boys could remember, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. What did the man look like? How tall was he? What was he wearing? What did his voice sound like? Did he have any distinguishing features? Did he say anything that might provide a clue to his identity? The boys did their best to recall everything, but the trauma of that night and the darkness and the masks the man wore made identification extremely difficult. Based on the boys' descriptions, composite sketches were created and distributed widely. These sketches showed a white male, possibly in his 30s or 40s, with a dark mask covering much of his face. The sketches were posted throughout Minnesota and neighboring states. They appeared on news broadcasts, in newspapers, on telephone poles and store windows. Anyone who saw the sketches was urged to contact law enforcement immediately if they recognized the man or had any information whatsoever about Jacob's disappearance. Tips began pouring in almost immediately. In the first weeks alone, hundreds of calls came into the dedicated tip line that had been established. Each tip, no matter how unlikely it seemed, was investigated. Some callers reported seeing a boy matching Jacob's description in various locations. Others called in suspicions about neighbors or acquaintances whose behavior seemed somehow off. Still others offered theories about what might have happened. Investigators worked around the clock, following up on every single lead, hoping that one of them would be the breakthrough that brought Jacob home. As the investigation progressed, certain suspects began to emerge as persons of interest. One of the most extensively investigated individuals in the early phases of the case was a man named Dan Rassier. Rassier lived on a farm very close to where Jacob was abducted. In fact, the driveway where the abduction took place was directly adjacent to his property. This geographical proximity naturally made him a person of interest to investigators. Rassier was interviewed multiple times. His property was searched repeatedly over the years. His life was essentially turned upside down by the suspicion that fell upon him. Rassier maintained his innocence throughout, insisting that he had nothing to do with Jacob's disappearance. He cooperated with investigators, submitted to interviews, allowed searches of his property. But the suspicion lingered for years, fueled by the simple fact of his proximity to the crime scene and certain statements he made that investigators found questionable. It would be many years before Rassier would be officially cleared of involvement, but by then, the damage to his reputation and his life had been done. This aspect of the case highlights one of the tragic side effects of such high-profile investigations. Innocent people can have their lives destroyed simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Other suspects were investigated as well. Sex offenders living in the area were tracked down and questioned. Anyone with a history of crimes against children was scrutinized. Transients who had been passing through the area around the time of the abduction were identified and located when possible. The investigation cast a wide net, and dozens of people found themselves under suspicion and subject to intense scrutiny by law enforcement. Each suspect represented hope that this might be the one, that this person might be responsible, that solving this case might finally be within reach. But each suspect investigation ultimately led nowhere, leaving investigators frustrated and the Wetterling family still without answers. The case generated massive media attention from the very beginning. Local news in Minnesota covered the story extensively, but it quickly went national and even international. The abduction of a child from a safe, small town resonated with parents everywhere. If this could happen in St. Joseph, Minnesota, it could happen anywhere. News cameras became a constant presence at the search headquarters and at the Wetterling home. Jerry and Patty Wetterling gave countless interviews, always hoping that one more appeal, one more plea for information, might be the one that brought Jacob home. As weeks turned into months, the massive search efforts began to scale back simply out of necessity. Volunteers couldn't maintain the daily searches indefinitely. Law enforcement resources couldn't remain fully dedicated to this one case forever, even though it remained a top priority. But the investigation never stopped. Detectives continued to work the case, following up on new tips as they came in, re-interviewing witnesses, reviewing evidence, searching for something that might have been missed the first time around. The first anniversary of Jacob's disappearance came and went without resolution. Then the second anniversary. Then the third. With each passing year, the statistical likelihood of finding Jacob alive diminished. Most child abduction cases are resolved, one way or another, within the first few days or weeks. Cases that stretch on for months or years typically end in tragedy. But Patty Wetterling refused to give up hope. She refused to accept that Jacob might not be coming home. She channeled her grief and fear into action, becoming a national advocate for missing children and for legislation that would help protect other children from suffering Jacob's fate. Out of the horror of Jacob's abduction came important changes in how America addresses crimes against children. Patty Wetterling worked tirelessly to lobby for stronger laws, for better tracking of sex offenders, for more resources dedicated to finding missing children. Her efforts would eventually result in federal legislation that bears Jacob's name. The Jacob Wetterling Crimes Against Children and Sexually Violent Offender Registration Act was signed into law in 1994, just 5 years after Jacob's disappearance. This federal law required states to implement sex offender registration programs, creating a system to track and monitor individuals convicted of crimes against children. The Wetterling Act was groundbreaking legislation that fundamentally changed how the United States deals with sex offenders. It required convicted offenders to register with law enforcement, providing their current address and other pertinent information. This registry would be maintained and updated, allowing authorities to keep track of where these individuals were living and to monitor their activities. The law represented a major step forward in child protection, creating accountability and transparency around individuals who posed a potential threat to children. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Because what I'm about to tell you next reveals the connection that investigators missed for nearly 3 decades, a connection that was right in front of them the entire time. But even as Jacob's disappearance led to important legislative changes, the question that mattered most to the Wetterling family remained unanswered: where was Jacob? What had happened to him that night? Was he still alive somewhere? These questions haunted everyone involved in the case. Investigators continued working every angle they could think of. They consulted with profilers and behavioral experts. They reviewed and re-reviewed evidence. They kept the case file active and continued to follow up on any new information that came to light. In 1990, just 9 months after Jacob's abduction, another disturbing crime occurred in Cold Spring, Minnesota, a town very close to St. Joseph. On January 13, 1990, a 12-year-old boy named Jared was attacked while walking home from a convenience store. A masked man in a vehicle pulled up beside him and asked for directions. When Jared approached the vehicle to help, the man grabbed him and forced him into the car. What followed was a terrifying ordeal in which the boy was assaulted. Miraculously, Jared managed to escape. He jumped from the vehicle while it was moving and ran to safety. Jared reported the attack to law enforcement, providing a description of his attacker and the vehicle. The similarities between this attack and Jacob's abduction were striking. Both involved young boys around the same age. Both occurred in small Minnesota towns very close to each other. Both involved a masked perpetrator. Both happened in the evening hours. The geographical proximity and the similar victim profile should have been glaring red flags that these crimes might be connected. You would think that investigators would immediately see the potential link and focus their efforts accordingly. But incredibly, the connection between these two crimes was not fully explored for many years. There were several reasons for this investigative failure. Different law enforcement agencies were handling the two cases. Communication between agencies, while it existed, was not as seamless as it should have been. The Jared case was classified as a sexual assault, while Jacob's case was a missing person case and presumed abduction. These different classifications meant the cases were handled by different units and investigated using different approaches. Additionally, there was some question about the reliability of witness descriptions. Jared's description of his attacker didn't perfectly match the description that Trevor and Aaron had given of Jacob's abductor. The vehicles that witnesses reported in connection with both incidents didn't match exactly. These discrepancies led investigators to believe, at least initially, that they might be dealing with two different perpetrators. It's easy to look back now and question how such an obvious connection could be missed, but in the moment, with incomplete information and the pressure to solve both cases, investigators followed the leads that seemed most promising. The man who attacked Jared was never caught in 1990. Like Jacob's abductor, he seemed to vanish without a trace. The investigation into Jared's assault continued, but without solid leads, it eventually went cold, much like Jacob's case. Two unsolved crimes involving young boys in neighboring Minnesota towns, and somehow the connection remained unexplored. It's one of the most frustrating aspects of this entire case when you look back at it with the benefit of hindsight. As the years continued to pass, the Jacob Wetterling case became something of a phenomenon in Minnesota. Everyone in the state knew Jacob's name and knew his face from the countless posters and news reports. The case became a symbol of every parent's worst nightmare and a rallying cry for child safety advocates. The Wetterling family remained in the public eye, continuing to push for answers and continuing to work on behalf of missing children everywhere. Patty Wetterling's advocacy work expanded significantly. She founded the Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, an organization dedicated to helping families of missing children and to educating communities about child safety. She spoke at conferences and events around the country. She met with lawmakers to push for stronger legislation. She became a nationally recognized expert on issues related to missing and exploited children. In some ways, her work helped bring meaning to the senseless tragedy of Jacob's disappearance, but it could never fill the void left by her missing son. The investigation into Jacob's disappearance never officially closed. It remained an active case, and detectives continued to work on it, though the intensity of the investigation naturally waxed and waned over the years depending on whether new leads emerged. The case file grew to massive proportions, containing thousands of pages of reports, interviews, and tips. More than 70,000 tips were received over the years, an almost incomprehensible number. Each of those tips represented someone who thought they might have information that could help solve the case. And each of those tips had to be evaluated and investigated to some degree. Technology advanced significantly during the decades that Jacob remained missing. DNA analysis became more sophisticated and more widely used in criminal investigations. Computer databases allowed for better tracking and cross-referencing of information. The Internet created new ways to share information about missing children, reaching audiences that would have been impossible to reach in 1989. All of these technological advances were applied to Jacob's case in hopes that they might provide the breakthrough that had remained so elusive. Periodically, there would be renewed searches of specific locations based on new information or tips that came in. Areas that had been searched before would be searched again with newer technology. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan locations where investigators thought Jacob might have been buried. Cadaver dogs were brought in to search properties where suspects had lived or worked. Each search raised hopes that this might be the one that would finally provide answers, but each search ended without finding Jacob. The toll on the Wetterling family was immeasurable. Living for years not knowing what happened to your child is a special kind of torture. There was no closure, no ability to properly grieve, no way to move forward with any certainty. They existed in a state of suspended animation, always hoping for the best but fearing the worst. Jacob's siblings grew up in the shadow of their brother's disappearance. His younger brother Trevor, who had been with Jacob that night, carried the additional burden of survivor's guilt and the trauma of having witnessed his brother's abduction. As the 10th anniversary of the abduction approached in 1999, there was renewed media attention on the case. Major news outlets revisited the story, examining what had been done to try to find Jacob and what had changed in terms of child protection laws since his disappearance. The anniversary became a time to reflect on the case and to renew the public appeal for information. But still, no significant breaks came. The investigation had identified numerous suspects over the years, and hundreds of people had been investigated to some degree. The case files contained the names of sex offenders, transients, suspicious individuals reported by citizens, and anyone else who might have had the means and opportunity to abduct Jacob. But despite all this investigative work, despite all the man-hours and resources dedicated to the case, the identity of Jacob's abductor remained unknown. It was as if the person had simply vanished after that October night in 1989, leaving no trace, no evidence, nothing that could lead investigators to him. As the case stretched into its second decade, new investigators were assigned to work on it. Fresh eyes reviewed the evidence, looking for something that might have been missed. The case was re-examined using modern criminal profiling techniques. Behavioral analysts studied everything known about the crime, trying to develop a psychological profile of the perpetrator that might help narrow down the list of suspects. But the case remained frustratingly unsolved. In 2010, on the eve of the 21st anniversary of Jacob's disappearance, there was a major development in the investigation. The FBI announced that they were conducting new searches of properties in the area where Jacob was abducted. These searches were based on new information that had come to light, though authorities were careful not to reveal exactly what that information was. Heavy equipment was brought in to excavate certain areas. Media attention focused intensely on these searches, with everyone hoping that this might finally be the moment when Jacob would be found. The searches centered on 2 farm properties, including the property owned by Dan Rassier, who had been a person of interest in the case since the beginning. The searches were extensive and went on for days. Every shovelful of dirt was carefully examined. Cadaver dogs searched the properties thoroughly. But once again, the searches ended without finding Jacob or any evidence that definitively connected anyone to his disappearance. The renewed hope that accompanied these searches gave way to disappointment and frustration once more. For Dan Rassier, the 2010 searches brought renewed scrutiny and suspicion. His name was once again in the headlines, associated with one of the most notorious crimes in Minnesota history. He continued to maintain his innocence, but the cloud of suspicion that hung over him was devastating. He sued law enforcement agencies involved in the investigation, claiming that he had been defamed and that the investigation had destroyed his life. The lawsuit highlighted the difficult balance that law enforcement must strike between thoroughly investigating all possible suspects and protecting the rights and reputations of innocent people. As the years continued to roll by, the case began to take on an almost mythical quality in Minnesota. It became the state's most famous unsolved crime, a cautionary tale about child safety, and a symbol of the devastating impact that one criminal act can have on an entire community. Jacob's face, frozen in time at 11 years old, stared out from posters and websites. If he were still alive, he would be aging, growing into adulthood, but in the public consciousness, he remained forever the smiling 11-year-old boy from the photographs taken before that October night. Behind the scenes, investigators never stopped working. The case remained open and active. As new detectives came onto the case, they would review everything from the beginning, sometimes spending months or even years familiarizing themselves with every detail of the investigation. They would re-interview witnesses when possible, looking for any detail that might have been forgotten or overlooked in earlier interviews. They would follow up on old leads that maybe hadn't been fully exhausted. They were looking for the one thread that, when pulled, might unravel the entire mystery. That thread finally appeared in 2015, 26 years after Jacob's abduction. And incredibly, it led back to the case that had occurred just 9 months after Jacob disappeared, the assault on young Jared in Cold Spring. After all these years, investigators finally made the connection that should have been made decades earlier. Using DNA evidence that had been collected from Jared's clothing back in 1990 but had not been thoroughly analyzed with modern techniques, investigators were able to develop a DNA profile of Jared's attacker. This DNA profile was entered into criminal databases and compared against the profiles of known sex offenders in Minnesota. And there was a match, not a direct match to the DNA profile, but a familial match that indicated the person who attacked Jared was related to someone in the database. This was the break that investigators had been waiting for, the piece of evidence that would finally crack not just Jared's case but, as it would turn out, Jacob's case as well. The familial DNA match pointed investigators toward a man named Danny Heinrich. Heinrich was a known sex offender who lived in the area where both crimes had occurred. He had actually been on law enforcement's radar since the early 90s in connection with various investigations into crimes against children, but he had never been directly connected to either Jacob's abduction or Jared's assault. Now, suddenly, DNA evidence was suggesting that he had attacked Jared. And if Heinrich had attacked Jared, could he also have been responsible for Jacob's disappearance? Investigators began to focus intensely on Danny Heinrich. They reviewed his entire criminal history. They looked at where he had lived and worked over the years. They examined his movements around the time of both crimes. And the more they looked, the more the pieces began to fit together. Heinrich had lived in the area. He had access to vehicles that matched some of the witness descriptions. He fit the general physical description that the boys had provided. And most importantly, he had a documented history of inappropriate behavior toward children. In July 2015, authorities executed a search warrant at Heinrich's residence in Annandale, Minnesota. What they found during that search was disturbing but also provided crucial evidence. They discovered child pornography on Heinrich's computer, which was itself a serious federal crime. But they also found other items that suggested Heinrich might be connected to other crimes against children. The evidence seized during that search would eventually give prosecutors the leverage they needed to make Heinrich talk about his past. Danny Heinrich was arrested and charged with federal child pornography offenses. These charges carried significant prison time, and Heinrich was facing the possibility of spending decades behind bars. But prosecutors and investigators weren't really interested in just putting Heinrich away for pornography charges. They wanted to know about Jacob Wetterling. They wanted to know about Jared. They wanted to know about any other crimes Heinrich might have committed against children. And they were willing to negotiate if it meant finally getting answers about what happened to Jacob. What followed was a series of negotiations between Heinrich's attorneys and federal prosecutors that would ultimately lead to one of the most significant plea deals in Minnesota legal history. The deal that was worked out was controversial but necessary. Heinrich would plead guilty to one count of receiving child pornography, which carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 5 years and a maximum of 20 years in federal prison. In exchange for this plea and a recommendation for a 20-year sentence, Heinrich would have to do something he had never done before: tell the truth about what happened to Jacob Wetterling. On September 2, 2016, nearly 27 years after Jacob's abduction, Danny Heinrich stood in federal court and confessed. The courtroom was packed with media, with law enforcement officers who had worked the case over the decades, with members of the community who had followed the case for years, and most importantly, with members of the Wetterling family. What Heinrich said in that courtroom that day finally provided the answers that everyone had been seeking for so long, but the answers were not the ones anyone wanted to hear. Heinrich described in chilling detail what had happened on the night of October 22, 1989. He had been driving around that evening, looking for a victim. When he saw the 3 boys riding their bikes, he saw an opportunity. He pulled his vehicle to the side of the road and waited for them. He put on a mask to conceal his identity and approached the boys with a gun. He ordered them off their bikes and made them lie in the ditch. After asking their ages, he chose Jacob and sent the other 2 boys running into the woods. Heinrich then forced Jacob into his vehicle and drove him to a rural location not far from where the abduction had taken place. What happened next is too disturbing to describe in detail, but Heinrich sexually assaulted Jacob. And then, in an act of unspeakable evil, he shot and killed the 11-year-old boy. Heinrich said that Jacob had asked to go home and had started to speak. Fearing that Jacob would be able to identify him, Heinrich shot him. He then buried Jacob's body in a field. After this initial confession, Heinrich led authorities to the location where he had buried Jacob all those years ago. In a field in a rural area of Stearns County, Minnesota, investigators began to dig. And there, buried under dirt that had remained undisturbed for 27 years, they found Jacob's remains. The boy who had been missing for so long, who had been searched for by thousands of volunteers, whose case had consumed countless hours of investigative work, was finally found. But he had been dead all along, killed on the very night he was taken, buried alone in a dark field far from his home and family. The discovery of Jacob's remains brought a devastating end to 27 years of hoping against hope that he might somehow still be alive. For the Wetterling family, it was the closure that they had simultaneously sought and dreaded. They finally knew what had happened to Jacob. They finally had his remains so they could properly lay him to rest. But the answers came with the confirmation of their worst fears: Jacob had suffered and died at the hands of a monster, and he had been gone since that very first night. Heinrich also confessed to being the person who had attacked Jared in Cold Spring 9 months after Jacob's murder. He described that assault in detail as well, confirming what investigators had finally come to realize: the 2 cases had been connected all along. The attack on Jared bore Heinrich's signature, the same predatory behavior, the same use of a vehicle and a mask, the same targeting of young boys in rural Minnesota towns. If investigators had made that connection earlier, if they had focused on Heinrich decades ago, might Jacob's case have been solved sooner? It's an agonizing question that has no good answer. As part of the plea agreement, Heinrich could not be prosecuted for Jacob's murder or for the assault on Jared. The statute of limitations had long since expired on those crimes, and prosecutors had agreed not to charge him in exchange for his confession and for leading them to Jacob's remains. This aspect of the plea deal was controversial. Many people felt that Heinrich should face murder charges, that he should spend the rest of his life in prison for what he did to Jacob. But prosecutors felt that getting the truth and getting Jacob back was more important than pursuing charges that might not stick and that might result in Heinrich never revealing what he had done. The sentencing hearing for Heinrich was held on November 21, 2016. It was an emotional day in federal court. Members of the Wetterling family were given the opportunity to address Heinrich directly, to tell him about the impact his actions had on their lives and on the community. Patty Wetterling, Jacob's mother, spoke with remarkable composure and strength. She told Heinrich that he had stolen Jacob from them, that he had robbed Jacob of his future, and that his actions had caused immeasurable pain. But she also spoke of forgiveness and of moving forward, demonstrating a grace that few could muster under such circumstances. The federal judge sentenced Heinrich to the maximum 20 years in federal prison on the child pornography charge. The judge made it clear that while Heinrich could not be prosecuted for Jacob's murder due to the plea agreement, the sentence was meant to keep him in prison for as long as legally possible given the charges he faced. 20 years for possession of child pornography was at the higher end of the sentencing guidelines, reflecting the court's understanding that Heinrich was being punished not just for the pornography but for being a dangerous predator who had destroyed lives. After Heinrich was sentenced and taken into custody, the Wetterling family held a press conference. They thanked the law enforcement officers who had never given up on finding Jacob. They thanked the community for their support over the nearly 3 decades of searching. And they talked about Jacob, remembering the boy he was and honoring his memory. They announced that they would continue their advocacy work for missing children and for child safety, channeling their grief into making sure that Jacob's legacy would be one of positive change. Jacob's remains were returned to his family, and he was finally laid to rest in a private ceremony. After 27 years of not knowing, of hoping, of searching, Jacob was finally home. It was an ending, but not the ending anyone had wanted. The boy who should have grown into a man, who should have had a full life ahead of him, was instead remembered as a child forever, taken far too soon by someone who saw him not as a person but as a victim. The revelation of what happened to Jacob and the resolution of his case sent shockwaves through Minnesota and beyond. For people who had followed the case for years, who had participated in searches, who had prayed for Jacob's safe return, learning the truth was devastating. But there was also a sense of relief that the family finally had answers, that the mystery that had haunted the state for so long had finally been solved. The resolution brought a mixture of sadness, anger, relief, and a renewed commitment to protecting children from predators like Danny Heinrich. In the aftermath of Heinrich's confession and sentencing, many questions were raised about the investigation. How had Heinrich avoided suspicion for so long? Why hadn't the connection between Jacob's abduction and Jared's assault been made earlier? Could Jacob's case have been solved years or even decades sooner if different investigative decisions had been made? These are difficult questions, and they don't have easy answers. Investigations are complex, hindsight is 20/20, and investigators can only work with the information and technology available to them at the time. It's true that Heinrich had been on law enforcement's radar since the early 1990s. In fact, he had been questioned in connection with the Jacob Wetterling case at one point, but at the time, there wasn't enough evidence to connect him definitively to the crime. He was also investigated in connection with other incidents involving children. But without DNA evidence clearly tying him to any specific crime, and without a confession, there wasn't enough to arrest and prosecute him. He was able to remain free, continuing to pose a threat, for more than 2 decades after he killed Jacob. The failure to connect Jacob's case and Jared's case earlier is perhaps the most troubling aspect of the investigation. The similarities between the two incidents should have been obvious, and a more thorough coordination between the different law enforcement agencies investigating each case might have led to Heinrich sooner. But communication between agencies in the 1990s wasn't what it is today. Technology for sharing information wasn't as advanced. And the sheer volume of tips and suspects in Jacob's case made it easy for certain leads to get lost in the shuffle. It's also worth noting that the DNA technology that ultimately helped identify Heinrich wasn't available in the early days of the investigation. Familial DNA searching, the technique that pointed investigators toward Heinrich, is a relatively recent development in forensic science. Without that technology, the DNA evidence collected from Jared's clothing in 1990 couldn't be used to identify Heinrich. So while mistakes were certainly made, and while the investigation could have been handled better in some respects, it's also true that some of the breakthroughs that eventually solved the case simply weren't possible in the earlier decades. The Jacob Wetterling case stands as a watershed moment in American criminal justice and child protection. The legislative changes that came about because of Jacob's disappearance, particularly the Jacob Wetterling Act and its subsequent expansions, have fundamentally changed how this country tracks and monitors sex offenders. These laws have undoubtedly prevented other crimes and helped solve cases that might otherwise have gone unsolved. Jacob's legacy, forged in tragedy, has been one of protection for countless other children. Patty Wetterling continued her advocacy work even after Jacob's remains were found and Heinrich was imprisoned. The Jacob Wetterling Resource Center, which later merged with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, has helped thousands of families dealing with missing children. Patty has spoken around the world about child safety, about the impact of violent crime on families, and about the need for better laws and better investigative techniques. She has turned her grief into purpose, ensuring that some measure of good has come from the unspeakable evil that took her son's life. The resolution of Jacob's case also brought closure to Jared, the boy who had been assaulted by Heinrich 9 months after Jacob's murder. Jared had carried the weight of that attack for decades, never knowing if his attacker would be caught, never knowing if there were other victims. When Heinrich confessed, Jared finally had answers as well. He knew who had attacked him and why. He knew that he wasn't alone, that there had been other victims. And he knew that Heinrich would finally face consequences for his actions, even if those consequences weren't as severe as many people felt they should be. Jared's bravery in surviving his attack and in cooperating with law enforcement over the years cannot be overstated. The evidence from his case, particularly the DNA evidence that had been preserved all those years, was ultimately what cracked both cases wide open. If Jared hadn't survived, if he hadn't reported what happened to him, if that evidence hadn't been collected and preserved, Heinrich might never have been identified. Jared played a crucial role in finally bringing justice, however imperfect that justice might be, for Jacob and for himself. The impact of Jacob's case extends far beyond Minnesota. It became a national story that resonated with parents everywhere. It changed conversations about child safety. It made people more aware of the dangers that children can face, even in seemingly safe communities. It led to increased vigilance and increased education about stranger danger and about the importance of teaching children how to protect themselves. In schools across America, children began receiving more comprehensive education about personal safety, about what to do if approached by a stranger, about the importance of trusting their instincts and seeking help from trusted adults. The case also highlighted the importance of never giving up on missing children cases. Law enforcement agencies across the country took note of how the Jacob Wetterling case was eventually solved and applied those lessons to their own cold cases. The use of advancing DNA technology, the importance of re-examining old evidence with new techniques, the value of fresh eyes reviewing old cases, all of these became standard practices in part because of what was learned from Jacob's case. In the years since Heinrich's confession and conviction, there has been ongoing discussion about whether the plea deal that was struck was the right decision. Some people believe that Heinrich should have been prosecuted for murder, that he should have received a life sentence without possibility of parole, that the 20-year sentence for child pornography was insufficient given the magnitude of his crimes. Others argue that the plea deal was necessary to finally get the truth, to find Jacob's remains, to give the family closure that they desperately needed and deserved. There's no easy answer to this debate. On one hand, it seems fundamentally unjust that someone who confessed to murdering a child would only serve 20 years in prison for an unrelated charge. On the other hand, without the plea deal, Heinrich likely would never have confessed, Jacob's remains might never have been found, and the family would still be living in uncertainty. Prosecutors had to make a difficult choice between pursuing justice in the traditional sense and providing answers and closure to a family that had suffered for nearly 3 decades. They chose closure, and while that choice remains controversial, it's hard to argue that it was the wrong one given the circumstances. It's also worth considering what would have happened if prosecutors had tried to charge Heinrich with Jacob's murder without the plea deal. The statute of limitations had expired on most charges related to the 1989 abduction. The physical evidence from the crime scene was limited. Without Heinrich's confession, proving beyond a reasonable doubt that he was responsible for Jacob's death would have been extremely difficult if not impossible. The DNA evidence connected him to Jared's assault, not to Jacob's case. Without a confession, Heinrich might have walked free on the murder charge, which would have been an even worse outcome. The child pornography charge, however, was solid. The evidence seized from Heinrich's home was clear and undeniable. He could be convicted on that charge and sentenced to significant prison time. So prosecutors used that charge as leverage to get what they really wanted, the truth about Jacob. It was a pragmatic decision, perhaps not entirely satisfying from a moral standpoint, but effective in achieving the goal of finally solving one of America's most notorious cold cases. Danny Heinrich will be in his 70s when he completes his 20-year federal prison sentence. Given his age and his status as a convicted sex offender, he will face lifetime supervision and monitoring once released. He will have to register as a sex offender wherever he lives, and his movements will be tracked by law enforcement. He will face significant restrictions on where he can live and work. In practical terms, his life after prison will be severely constrained, which provides some additional measure of justice beyond the prison sentence itself. But for many people, particularly those who knew and loved Jacob, no amount of prison time will ever be enough. No punishment can truly fit the crime of taking an innocent child's life. No sentence can undo the decades of pain and suffering that the Wetterling family endured. Justice in cases like this is always imperfect, always incomplete, because nothing can bring Jacob back, nothing can restore what was taken from him and from those who loved him. The location where Jacob's remains were found, that rural field where Heinrich had buried him 27 years earlier, has taken on a solemn significance. It's a place of quiet reflection, a place where people can go to remember Jacob and to contemplate the fragility of life and the presence of evil in the world. The Wetterling family has worked to ensure that the location is treated with respect, that it serves as a memorial not just to Jacob but to all missing children. In the years since the case was resolved, there have been numerous retrospectives and examinations of the investigation. Journalists, criminologists, and legal experts have analyzed every aspect of the case, from the initial response on the night of the abduction to the final confession and sentencing. These analyses have identified both the strengths and weaknesses of the investigation, providing valuable lessons for law enforcement agencies dealing with similar cases. One of the key takeaways from the case is the critical importance of interagency cooperation and communication. The failure to immediately connect Jacob's case with Jared's assault stemmed in part from inadequate communication between the different law enforcement agencies involved. Since then, there have been significant improvements in how agencies share information, particularly when dealing with crimes against children. Regional task forces and fusion centers now allow for better coordination and information sharing, making it less likely that similar connections would be missed in the future. Another important lesson involves the preservation and analysis of evidence. The DNA evidence collected from Jared's clothing in 1990 sat in storage for many years before it was analyzed using more modern techniques. This highlights the importance of preserving all evidence from crime scenes, even when current technology might not be able to fully analyze it. As forensic science advances, evidence that was once of limited value can become crucial to solving cases. Many law enforcement agencies have since implemented better protocols for evidence preservation and for periodically re-examining old evidence with new technologies. The case also demonstrated the value of never closing cold cases, of continuing to work them even when years or decades have passed without significant progress. The investigators who kept working on Jacob's case, who kept reviewing files and following up on leads even 25 years after the abduction, ultimately were the ones who solved it. Their persistence and dedication paid off in the end, providing a powerful example of why cold case units and continuing investigations are so important. For the community of St. Joseph, Minnesota, the resolution of Jacob's case brought mixed emotions. There was relief that the mystery had finally been solved, that the person responsible was in prison, that the Wetterling family finally had answers. But there was also renewed grief at the confirmation that Jacob had been dead all along, that he had suffered and died on the very night he was taken. The community that had spent 27 years hoping for Jacob's safe return now had to collectively mourn his loss. St. Joseph has worked to honor Jacob's memory in meaningful ways. There are memorials and dedications to him throughout the town. His story is taught in schools as part of child safety education. The community has rallied around the Wetterling family, supporting their advocacy work and their efforts to prevent other families from experiencing similar tragedies. In this way, Jacob's impact on his hometown has been lasting and positive, even though his story ended in tragedy. The broader impact of Jacob's case on American culture and law cannot be overstated. Before Jacob Wetterling, stranger abductions were something that happened but weren't talked about as openly or as frequently. Parents were aware of dangers but perhaps not as vigilant as they became after Jacob's case captured national attention. The massive media coverage of his disappearance brought the issue of child abduction into millions of American homes, making it impossible to ignore. This increased awareness led to changes in how parents approached child safety. Children were given more instruction on staying safe, on not talking to strangers, on what to do if they felt threatened or uncomfortable. Parents became more vigilant about knowing where their children were and who they were with. Communities started organizing neighborhood watch programs and instituting safety measures designed to protect children. While some critics argue that this led to an overprotective culture that limited children's independence, most would agree that increased awareness and vigilance is a net positive when it comes to child safety. The legislative legacy of Jacob's case is perhaps its most enduring impact. The Jacob Wetterling Act, which was later strengthened and expanded through Megan's Law and the Adam Walsh Child Protection and Safety Act, created a comprehensive national system for tracking sex offenders. These laws require convicted sex offenders to register with law enforcement, provide updated information about their whereabouts, and in many cases, have their information made available to the public through online registries. These sex offender registries have been controversial. Supporters argue that they provide valuable information to communities, allowing parents and law enforcement to be aware of convicted offenders living in their areas. Critics contend that the registries can lead to vigilante justice, make it difficult for offenders who have served their time to reintegrate into society, and may not actually be effective at preventing crimes. Despite these debates, the registries remain in place across the United States, a direct legacy of Jacob Wetterling's case and his family's advocacy. Beyond the legal and policy changes, Jacob's case has had a profound cultural impact. It has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and news specials. These retellings of Jacob's story have kept his memory alive and continue to educate new generations about child safety and the importance of never giving up on missing children. Each retelling serves as both a memorial to Jacob and a warning about the dangers that children can face. The case has also influenced how media covers missing children cases. The extensive coverage of Jacob's disappearance set something of a template for how these stories are reported. The focus on the family, the updates on the search efforts, the appeals for information from the public, all of these elements have become standard in coverage of missing children cases. For better or worse, Jacob's case helped establish missing children stories as a major genre of crime reporting. One of the most poignant aspects of Jacob's story is thinking about the life he should have had. He would have graduated high school in the mid-90s. He might have gone to college, started a career, gotten married, had children of his own. He would be in his mid-40s now, potentially with a full, rich life behind him and many years still ahead. Instead, his life was cut short at 11 years old, all of those possibilities erased in a moment of violence. His family has had to live with that loss, with the knowledge of everything Jacob missed out on, everything they missed out on with him. They never got to see him grow up, never got to attend his high school graduation or his wedding, never got to meet his children if he had chosen to have them. These are the invisible victims of crimes like this, the losses that can't be quantified, the futures that were stolen not just from Jacob but from everyone who loved him. Trevor Wetterling, Jacob's younger brother who was with him on the night of the abduction, has lived with unique trauma. He witnessed his brother being taken. He was told to run into the woods and not look back. He carried that memory for 27 years before learning what had actually happened to Jacob. The guilt that survivors often feel, the what-ifs and the self-blame, must have been overwhelming at times. Trevor has largely stayed out of the public eye, but the impact of that October night on his life has undoubtedly been profound and lasting. Jacob's other siblings have also had to grow up in the shadow of his disappearance. Their brother became a national symbol, his face on posters everywhere, his case constantly in the news. Their parents became famous advocates and public figures. The family could never have a normal, private existence because Jacob's case was always there, always a part of their identity. They've handled this with remarkable grace, supporting their parents' advocacy work while also trying to live their own lives. Jerry Wetterling, Jacob's father, was always somewhat less in the public eye than Patty, but his grief and his commitment to finding Jacob were no less intense. He supported all of the advocacy work, participated in countless searches and appeals for information, and held his family together through decades of uncertainty. The strength required to do this, to keep going day after day while not knowing what happened to your child, is almost unimaginable. The investigators who worked on Jacob's case over the years were also profoundly affected by it. Many of them dedicated years or even decades to trying to solve the case. They reviewed thousands of tips, interviewed hundreds of suspects, worked countless overtime hours, all in pursuit of finding one missing boy. When the case was finally solved, it brought a sense of accomplishment and relief, but also grief at learning what had happened to Jacob. For these investigators, Jacob was more than just a case number, he became a personal mission. The volunteers who searched for Jacob, the community members who never gave up hope, the thousands of people who called in tips or put up posters or donated money to help with the search, all of them were invested in finding Jacob. When the truth finally came out, they too had to process the reality that despite all their efforts, Jacob had been dead since that first night. It's a sobering reminder that sometimes, no matter how hard people try, no matter how much time and resources are dedicated to a cause, the outcome can still be tragic. The psychological impact of cases like Jacob's extends beyond those directly involved. Parents across America who followed Jacob's case experienced vicarious trauma, imagining what they would do if their own child was taken. This heightened anxiety about child safety has had both positive and negative effects. It's led to increased vigilance and better safety education, but it's also contributed to a culture of fear where children have less freedom and independence than previous generations enjoyed. Before we close this case, I want to take a moment to address something important. If you've made it this far through this incredibly difficult story, if you've stayed with me through every heartbreaking detail, then I need you to do something. I need you to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Turn on notifications so you never miss when we cover another case. Drop a like on this video to help spread awareness about Jacob's story and about child safety. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And please, leave a comment telling me what you think about this case, about how it was handled, about the plea deal, about anything that struck you. Your engagement helps us continue to bring you these important stories. More importantly, it keeps cases like Jacob's in the public consciousness, ensuring that these victims are never forgotten. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring enough to listen to the whole story. The trial and conviction of Danny Heinrich, while providing closure, also opened up new questions. Had Heinrich committed other crimes against children that remained unknown? He had decades of freedom between killing Jacob and finally being caught. The thought that there might be other victims out there, other families who never got answers, is deeply troubling. Law enforcement investigated whether Heinrich might be connected to other unsolved cases, but no definitive links were established. Still, given his predatory behavior and the length of time he remained free, it seems likely that Jacob and Jared were not his only victims. The case also raised important questions about how society deals with sex offenders and how to prevent crimes against children in the first place. Heinrich had shown signs of being a danger to children, yet he was able to move freely through society, able to access potential victims, able to commit terrible crimes. Even after the Jacob Wetterling Act and subsequent legislation created sex offender registries, offenders can still pose threats. The registries help track known offenders, but they don't prevent first-time offenses, and they rely on offenders complying with registration requirements. Preventing crimes like the ones Heinrich committed requires a multifaceted approach. It requires education for children about personal safety. It requires parents being involved and aware of their children's activities and whereabouts. It requires communities looking out for one another and reporting suspicious behavior. It requires law enforcement having the resources and training to investigate crimes against children effectively. And it requires appropriate consequences for those who harm children, both to punish them and to protect society from them. The Jacob Wetterling case also highlighted the importance of support for families of missing children. The uncertainty, the not knowing, can be psychologically devastating. Organizations like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which worked closely with the Wetterling family, provide crucial support and resources to families going through similar ordeals. They offer counseling, help coordinate searches, assist with media relations, and provide a community of people who understand what it's like to have a missing child. This support network, which has grown significantly since Jacob's disappearance, is part of his lasting legacy. The advancements in technology that helped solve Jacob's case continue to evolve. DNA analysis becomes more sophisticated every year. Databases of DNA profiles grow larger and more comprehensive. Techniques like genetic genealogy, which has been used to solve other cold cases, offer new hope for families of missing or murdered children. The tools that investigators have at their disposal today are vastly superior to what was available in 1989, and they continue to improve, offering hope that other long unsolved cases might finally be resolved. Social media and the internet have also changed how missing children cases are handled. Information can be disseminated instantly to millions of people. Photos and descriptions can be shared across the country or around the world in seconds. Amber Alerts, which use technology to broadcast information about abducted children to people's phones and to electronic highway signs, have helped recover numerous children quickly. These systems, which didn't exist when Jacob was taken, are another part of the legacy of his case and of other high-profile child abductions. Looking back at Jacob's case from the perspective of several years after its resolution, several things become clear. First, the case was always solvable. The person responsible, Danny Heinrich, was known to law enforcement relatively early in the investigation. The connection to Jared's assault was there to be found. With better communication, more advanced technology, and perhaps a bit more luck, the case might have been solved years or even decades earlier. This isn't to blame the investigators who worked on the case, they did their best with the resources and knowledge they had, but rather to acknowledge that sometimes cases remain unsolved not because they're inherently unsolvable but because of limitations in resources, technology, or investigative approaches. Second, the importance of DNA evidence cannot be overstated. It was ultimately DNA analysis that pointed investigators toward Heinrich and allowed them to solve both Jacob's case and Jared's case. This underscores the critical importance of collecting and preserving biological evidence from crime scenes, even when that evidence can't be fully analyzed with current technology. You never know when advances in forensic science will make previously unusable evidence suddenly valuable. Third, the resolution of the case demonstrated that it's never too late to solve a cold case. 27 years is an incredibly long time, but investigators never gave up, and their persistence eventually paid off. This should provide hope to families of other missing children and to investigators working on other cold cases. Time may pass, trails may grow cold, but with dedication and the right breaks, cases can be solved even after decades. The plea deal that brought closure to Jacob's case remains controversial, and reasonable people can disagree about whether it was the right approach. But what's undeniable is that it achieved what 27 years of investigation hadn't been able to achieve: it brought Jacob home. It gave his family the answers they desperately needed. And it put a dangerous predator behind bars for a significant period of time. Perfect justice may not have been served, but in a case as complicated and difficult as this one, perhaps the closure and peace that the family gained was worth the compromises that were made. Patty Wetterling has said in interviews since the case was resolved that learning what happened to Jacob, as horrible as the truth was better than not knowing. The uncertainty of those 27 years, the constant wondering and hoping and fearing, was in some ways worse than knowing the terrible truth. At least with the truth, they could grieve properly. They could lay Jacob to rest. They could begin to heal in a way that wasn't possible when he was missing. This perspective helps explain why the plea deal, despite its controversial nature, was ultimately accepted by the family. The story of Jacob Wetterling is ultimately a story about evil and about the profound impact that one evil act can have on countless lives. But it's also a story about resilience, about a family that refused to give up, about a community that came together in support of one of its own, about investigators who never stopped working to find answers. It's a story about how tragedy can be transformed into positive change, about how laws can be passed and systems can be improved to protect others from suffering similar fates. Jacob's legacy lives on in the laws that bear his name, in the increased awareness about child safety, in the support systems that now exist for families of missing children, and in the memories of all those who knew him and loved him. He was taken from this world far too soon, but he has not been forgotten. His story continues to resonate, continues to teach, continues to inspire action to protect children. As we close this examination of Jacob Wetterling's case, it's important to remember that he was more than just a victim, more than just a case file, more than just a name attached to legislation. He was a real boy with hopes and dreams, with a family who loved him, with a future that should have been filled with possibilities. He loved hockey and hanging out with his friends. He was a good student and a loving son and brother. Those 11 years of his life mattered, and the fact that they were cut short makes his story all the more tragic. For anyone listening to this story who has children or who works with children, let Jacob's case be a reminder of the importance of vigilance and education about child safety. Talk to your children about staying safe. Teach them that it's okay to say no to adults who make them uncomfortable. Let them know they can always come to you if something doesn't feel right. Be aware of where your children are and who they're with. These simple steps, while they can't guarantee safety, can significantly reduce the risk. For those working in law enforcement, Jacob's case offers valuable lessons about the importance of interagency cooperation, about preserving evidence for future analysis, about the value of applying new technologies to old cases, and about the critical importance of never giving up on finding missing children. Every tip matters. Every lead deserves to be followed. Every missing child deserves the same level of dedication and resources that were ultimately brought to bear on Jacob's case. For society as a whole, Jacob's case reminds us that protecting children is everyone's responsibility. It takes a community to keep children safe. It takes awareness, vigilance, and a willingness to speak up when something seems wrong. It takes supporting law enforcement and supporting legislation that helps track and monitor those who pose threats to children. And it takes never forgetting victims like Jacob, ensuring that their stories continue to be told and that the lessons from their cases continue to inform how we protect children going forward. The resolution of Jacob Wetterling's case after 27 years was both an ending and a beginning. It ended decades of uncertainty and searching. It gave his family the closure they needed to properly grieve and to begin healing. But it also began a new chapter in their advocacy work, now informed by knowing the full truth of what happened. It reinforced the importance of the legislative changes that had been made in Jacob's name and highlighted areas where more work still needs to be done to protect children. Danny Heinrich will spend many years in federal prison, and when he is eventually released, he will face a lifetime of restrictions and monitoring. But no punishment can truly balance the scales of justice for what he took from Jacob and from the Wetterling family. The only solace is that he can never hurt another child again, that his confession brought some measure of peace to those affected by his crimes, and that his capture and conviction demonstrated that no matter how much time passes, justice can eventually be served. The final chapter of Jacob Wetterling's story was written in that courtroom in 2016 when Danny Heinrich confessed to his crimes. But Jacob's impact continues to this day and will continue into the future. Every child who is protected because of laws passed in Jacob's name, every case that is solved using techniques refined through the investigation of his disappearance, every family that receives support through organizations created in response to his case, all of these represent Jacob's ongoing legacy. In remembering Jacob Wetterling, we honor not just his memory but the memories of all children who have been taken from us too soon. We recommit ourselves to doing everything in our power to protect children, to find those who are missing, and to bring those who harm children to justice. We acknowledge the incredible strength and resilience of families like the Wetterlings who turn their grief into action and their pain into purpose. 27 years is a long time to wait for answers. For the Wetterling family, it must have seemed like an eternity. But they never gave up hope that someday they would know what happened to Jacob. When those answers finally came, they were devastating but also, in their own way, a relief. The not knowing was finally over. Jacob could finally rest in peace, and his family could begin the long process of healing that had been impossible while his fate remained uncertain. This case changed Minnesota. It changed how law enforcement approaches missing children cases. It changed federal law and policy around sex offenders. It changed how parents think about child safety. One boy's tragedy rippled outward, affecting millions of people and changing systems that govern how we protect our most vulnerable citizens. This is Jacob Wetterling's legacy, born from unspeakable evil but ultimately contributing to positive change that has helped protect countless other children. As we conclude this deep dive into one of America's most significant cold cases, I want you to remember Jacob not as a victim or a cautionary tale, but as a real person who lived and laughed and loved. Remember him as the 11-year-old boy who rode his bike to rent a video with his brother and friend on an autumn evening. Remember him as a son and a brother who was loved deeply and is missed profoundly. And remember that his story, as tragic as it is, has meaning and purpose because of what his family has done to ensure that some good came from their devastating loss. Thank you for taking this journey with me through one of the most complex and emotionally challenging cases in American criminal history. If this story affected you, if it made you think differently about child safety or about the importance of never giving up on missing children, then Jacob's legacy lives on through you as well. Hit that subscribe button, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and most importantly, hug your loved ones a little tighter tonight. Life is precious and fragile, and we should never take for granted the time we have with those we love. This is Cold Case 247, and until next time, stay safe, stay vigilant, and never forget the victims whose stories deserve to be told.